I stood in the sterile hospital conference room, my hands trembling, as I faced my screaming mother Margaret, my desperate father Robert, and my pale sister Diana, who lay in the bed needing bone marrow. The doctor had just confirmed I was a perfect match. Margaret's voice echoed off the walls about family obligation, while Diana weakly pleaded with tears streaming down her face. I quietly reached into my purse and pulled out DNA test results. My voice barely a whisper. Actually, she's not my sister. The room fell dead silent as the papers fluttered to the floor. 6 months earlier, my life was completely different. I was the rising star at Premier Marketing Solutions in Chicago, riding the wave of success that I had worked so hard to achieve. At 28 years old, I had climbed the corporate ladder faster than anyone expected, and I was about to land the biggest client in our company's history. Hartwell Industries represented a $12 million annual contract, the kind of deal that would secure my career and set me up for partnership within 5 years. I had spent 18 months cultivating this relationship with CEO Jonathan Hartwell. Every coffee meeting, every golf game, every carefully crafted proposal had been building toward this moment. Jonathan was notoriously difficult to work with, having fired 3 marketing agencies in the past 2 years, but somehow I had managed to earn his trust and respect. He appreciated my straightforward approach and innovative strategies that focused on authentic brand storytelling rather than flashy gimmicks. The presentation was scheduled for Friday morning at 10 o'clock. I had rehearsed every slide, anticipated every possible question, and prepared backup materials for any scenario. My confidence was unshakable because I knew this campaign was brilliant. It would transform Hartwell Industries from a regional manufacturing company into a nationally recognized brand with genuine emotional connection to consumers. 3 days before the presentation, Diana visited my office at Premier Marketing Solutions. This wasn't unusual since we had always been close sisters, or so I thought. She claimed she needed career advice about transitioning from her small marketing startup to a larger firm. Diana had always struggled professionally, jumping from job to job without ever finding her footing. So I was happy to help her figure out her next steps. We spent 2 hours in my office discussing industry trends, networking strategies, and potential career paths. Diana seemed genuinely interested in my advice, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions about client management and business development. I even showed her some of my presentation materials for Hartwell Industries as examples of high-level client work explaining my strategic thinking and creative approach. What I didn't notice was Diana discreetly photographing my computer screen and presentation materials with her phone while I was grabbing us coffee from the break room. She had positioned herself perfectly to capture every slide, every strategic document, and every piece of confidential client information that I had shared with her in good faith. 2 days later, I arrived at Hartwell Industries headquarters feeling excited and prepared. The building's glass facade reflected the morning sun as I walked through the lobby, carrying my presentation materials and laptop bag. I had chosen my best navy blue suit and practiced my opening remarks one final time in the elevator. When I reached Jonathan's executive conference room, his assistant Sarah greeted me with an uncomfortable expression. Something felt wrong immediately, but I couldn't quite identify what had shifted in the atmosphere. Jonathan entered the room looking stern and cold, completely different from our previous friendly interactions. "Francesca," he said, without his usual warm greeting, "we need to talk before we proceed with any presentation." My stomach dropped as he continued speaking. "Yesterday, we received a very concerning presentation from Bright Future Marketing. They presented a campaign strategy that was remarkably similar to concepts you had mentioned in our previous conversations. However, they also provided us with some disturbing information about your business practices." I felt the color drain from my face as Jonathan pulled out a folder containing what appeared to be my exact presentation materials, but with Bright Future Marketing's logo instead of Premier Marketing Solutions. Every slide, every creative concept, every strategic insight that I had developed over months of work was now credited to Diana's company. Bright Future Marketing warned us that Premier Marketing Solutions might attempt to steal their ideas and present them as original work. Jonathan continued, his voice growing colder with each word. They provided documentation, showing that you had access to their materials and might try to claim credit for their creative strategy. The room started spinning as I realized what had happened. Diana hadn't visited my office seeking career advice. She had come to steal 18 months of my work and then preemptively accused me of planning to steal from her. It was a perfect setup that left me looking like the guilty party while she appeared to be the victim protecting her intellectual property. "Jonathan, I can explain," I started, but he held up his hand to stop me. "Frankly, Francesca, I'm disappointed. I thought we had built a relationship based on trust and mutual respect. The fact that you would attempt corporate espionage and theft of intellectual property shows a serious lack of professional integrity." I tried to defend myself, showing him timestamps on my files and explaining my development process, but the damage was already done. Diana had not only stolen my work, but had convinced Jonathan that I was the thief. The meeting ended with Jonathan terminating our business relationship effective immediately and warning that he would be contacting other industry leaders about Premier Marketing Solutions' alleged unethical practices. As I walked back to my car in the parking garage, I called Diana's number with shaking fingers. When she answered, her voice was sickeningly sweet. "Oh, hi, Francesca. How did your presentation go?" "You know exactly how it went," I said, fighting back tears of rage and betrayal. "How could you do this to me?" "I have no idea what you're talking about," Diana replied with fake confusion. "I hope everything worked out well for you. Family should always support each other's success." The line went dead, leaving me standing alone in the dim parking garage, realizing that my own sister had just destroyed everything I had worked for. But this was only the beginning of discovering how deep her betrayal actually went. I returned to Premier Marketing Solutions, feeling like I had been hit by a truck. The familiar office environment that had always felt like my second home now seemed alien and threatening. My colleagues avoided eye contact as I walked to my corner office, and I could hear hushed whispers following me down the hallway. Before I could even set down my briefcase, my boss, Paul Anderson, appeared in my doorway looking grim. Paul had been my mentor for 3 years, the man who had promoted me twice, and consistently praised my innovative approach to client relations. Seeing his disappointed expression was almost more painful than losing the Hartwell account. "Francesca, we need to talk immediately," he said in a tone I had never heard him use with me before. "Sandra from HR is waiting in conference room B." Sandra Williams, our human resources director, had spread out several manila folders across the conference table when we arrived. Her usually friendly demeanor was replaced by cold professionalism as she gestured for me to sit down across from her. "We received some very serious allegations about your conduct with the Hartwell Industries account." Sandra began, opening the first folder. "We've also received additional information suggesting a pattern of unethical behavior that requires immediate investigation." My heart sank as she revealed printed emails that appeared to show me offering to sell confidential client information to competitors. The email addresses were mine, but I had never written these messages. The language sounded like me, but the content was completely fabricated. These emails were provided by Bright Future Marketing as evidence that you've been engaging in corporate espionage for months. Paul said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "They claim you approached them offering Premier's client lists and strategic documents in exchange for money." I stared at the papers in disbelief. The emails were sophisticated forgeries that included accurate details about our internal processes and client relationships. Someone with extensive knowledge of our company operations had created these false communications, and I knew exactly who that someone was. This is impossible, I said, my voice shaking. I would never sell company information. These emails are fake. Sandra pulled out another folder containing photographs that made my blood run cold. They were the pictures Diana had taken in my office 3 days earlier, but the context had been completely manipulated. The photos were presented as evidence that I was documenting confidential materials for the purpose of selling them to competitors. We also have witness statements from your assistant Kelly about suspicious behavior over the past few months. Sandra continued. She reported that you've been asking unusual questions about client communications meeting schedules and internal company policies. Kelly Martinez had been my assistant for 8 months. She was a recent college graduate who I had been mentoring, helping her develop professional skills and industry knowledge. The idea that she would provide statements against me was devastating, but I realized that Diana had been manipulating her as well. Kelly was just learning about our industry, I protested. I was teaching her about client management and business development. There was nothing suspicious about our conversations. Paul shook his head sadly. The pattern of behavior described in these reports suggests systematic information gathering for unauthorized purposes. Combined with the Hartwell Industries incident and these fabricated emails, we have no choice but to begin termination procedures. The next 2 hours were a blur of paperwork accusations and legal disclaimers. Premier Marketing Solutions was terminating my employment effective immediately to avoid potential lawsuits from clients who might have been affected by my alleged corporate espionage. They were also considering legal action against me if additional evidence of wrongdoing emerged. Security escorted me to my office to collect personal belongings while Sandra supervised. 3 years of career achievements, client relationships, and professional growth were reduced to a cardboard box of personal items. My colleagues watched in silence as I was walked out of the building like a criminal. The Hartwell Industries contract went to Bright Future Marketing that same afternoon. Diana had not only destroyed my career, but had profited from the destruction by stealing my work and my biggest client. But even worse was yet to come, as I would soon discover the true scope of her systematic campaign against me. Over the next week, I applied for positions at 5 different marketing firms in Chicago. My resume was impressive, my portfolio was strong, and I had excellent references from previous employers. 3 companies scheduled interviews, immediately expressing enthusiasm about my experience and track record. The first interview was with Creative Solutions Agency on Monday morning. The hiring manager, Jennifer Walsh, seemed genuinely excited about my background and spent an hour discussing potential projects and team dynamics. She scheduled a second interview for Wednesday and mentioned that they were eager to move quickly with the right candidate. Tuesday afternoon, Jennifer called to cancel the Wednesday interview. Her tone was completely different, formal, and uncomfortable. We've decided to pursue other candidates who might be a better fit for our company culture, she said without explanation. The same thing happened with Morrison Marketing Group and Pinnacle Brand Strategy. Enthusiastic initial conversations, followed by sudden rejections within 24 hours. No explanations, no feedback, just closed doors and uncomfortable phone calls. My former colleague, Marcus Thompson, called me Thursday evening with disturbing news. Marcus had moved to Sterling Communications 6 months earlier, and he had inside knowledge about what was happening to my job applications. Francesca, I need to tell you something and you're not going to like it, Marcus said, his voice heavy with concern. Someone has been calling around the industry warning companies about you. They're claiming you have a history of corporate theft and ethical violations. My hands started shaking as Marcus continued. The caller identifies herself as your sister Diana. She presents herself as someone who cares about you, but feels obligated to warn potential employers about your character issues. She provides specific examples of problems at your previous jobs, including client complaints and internal conflicts that supposedly forced you to leave Premier Marketing. I felt sick to my stomach as I realized the scope of Diana's campaign against me. She wasn't content with destroying my current job. She was systematically eliminating any possibility of future employment in my chosen field. Marcus, none of those things are true, I said, fighting back tears. I've never had client complaints or ethical violations. Diana is my sister, but she's the one who sabotaged my career at Premier. I believe you, Marcus said gently, but Diana is very convincing. She sounds genuinely concerned about your well-being and claims she's trying to prevent you from making the same mistakes at other companies. Most hiring managers believe they're getting inside information from a caring family member who wants to protect both you and potential employers. The conversation with Marcus revealed the true sophistication of Diana's plan. She had created false documentation of problems that never existed, including fake client complaints and fabricated performance issues from my employment history. She presented these materials to potential employers as the evidence of a pattern of unprofessional behavior that made me unsuitable for hiring. As I hung up the phone that night, I realized that Diana hadn't just stolen one client or ruined one job. She had systematically destroyed my entire professional reputation and eliminated my ability to work in the marketing industry anywhere in Chicago. But I still had no idea that this level of calculated destruction had been going on for much longer than I could have imagined. The full extent of my professional exile became clear over the following weeks as I watched my entire career crumble. Diana's campaign was more sophisticated and far-reaching than I had initially realized. She hadn't just targeted my current job situation. She had been laying groundwork for my destruction for months, maybe even years. My savings account dwindled rapidly as I struggled to find any kind of employment. The marketing industry in Chicago was surprisingly small, with most senior professionals knowing each other through professional associations and networking events. Diana had poisoned those relationships systematically, ensuring that my reputation preceded me wherever I applied. I broadened my search to entry-level positions, thinking I could rebuild my career from the ground up. Even those opportunities disappeared after initial positive conversations. Receptionist positions, administrative roles, and junior marketing coordinator jobs all followed the same pattern. Initial interest, followed by sudden rejection without explanation. Jennifer Chen, a recruiter who had placed me at Premier Marketing Solutions 3 years earlier, agreed to meet me for coffee at a downtown Starbucks. Jennifer had always been honest with me about market conditions and career prospects, so I hoped she could provide insight into what was happening. "Francesca, I need to be direct with you," Jennifer said, stirring sugar into her latte. "Your name is being associated with some serious professional issues. Multiple companies have contacted me, asking about your background, and the information they received suggests significant problems with integrity and reliability." She pulled out her phone and showed me a detailed document that Diana had apparently distributed throughout the professional community. The document outlined a pattern of ethical violations, client conflicts, and performance issues that painted a picture of someone completely unsuitable for professional employment. "According to this report, you've been struggling with alcohol dependency, which affected your work performance," Jennifer read from her phone. "There are documented incidents of missed deadlines, inappropriate client communications, and conflicts with supervisors that led to your termination from Premier Marketing." Every single allegation was false, but the documentation was professionally presented and included specific dates, names, and incidents that sounded convincing to anyone who didn't know the truth. Diana had spent considerable time and effort creating a false professional history that would follow me anywhere I tried to work. "The person who provided this information claims to be your sister and says she's trying to help you get appropriate treatment for your issues," Jennifer continued. "She presents herself as someone who loves you, but feels obligated to prevent you from taking on professional responsibilities you can't handle." The manipulation was masterful. Diana positioned herself as the caring sister, trying to protect both me and potential employers from the consequences of my supposed problems. She appeared concerned and helpful while systematically destroying any possibility of my professional rehabilitation. I tried to defend myself, explaining the truth about what had happened at Premier Marketing and providing documentation of my actual performance reviews and client feedback. But Jennifer looked uncomfortable and unconvinced. Francesca, I want to believe you, but the evidence against you is extensive and comes from a credible source, she said apologetically. Your sister provided documentation going back years, including problems at your previous jobs that you never mentioned to me. As Jennifer left the coffee shop, I realized that Diana had been planning my professional destruction for much longer than I had imagined. The Hartwell Industries incident wasn't an opportunistic attack. It was the culmination of a years-long campaign to eliminate me as professional competition while positioning herself as a successful stable sister. Over the next month, I applied for positions outside the marketing industry, hoping that Diana's influence wouldn't extend to other fields. I interviewed for sales positions, administrative roles, and customer service jobs. The same pattern repeated itself: initial interest, followed by sudden rejection after additional reference checks. My unemployment benefits barely covered basic living expenses. I had to move out of my downtown apartment and into a studio in a less desirable neighborhood. The designer clothing that had been essential for client meetings was sold online to pay for groceries and utilities. The financial stress was devastating, but the emotional impact was even worse. I had always defined myself through professional achievement and career success. Watching everything I had worked for disappear while being unable to fight back was psychological torture. Diana called occasionally during this period, presenting herself as the supportive sister who was concerned about my unemployment situation. She offered to help me find work in her professional network, not knowing that I was aware of her role in my problems. I've been asking around about marketing positions, she said during one particularly cruel phone call. Several companies mentioned they were looking for someone with your experience, but when I recommended you, they said they had heard concerning things about your professional background. She managed to sound genuinely puzzled and sympathetic while twisting the knife deeper. I defended you, of course, but I think you might need to consider whether there's some truth to what people are saying. Maybe this is an opportunity for self-reflection and personal growth. The gaslighting was sophisticated and persistent. Diana was rewriting reality to make me question my own memories and experiences while positioning herself as the voice of reason and family support. 3 months after losing my job at Premier Marketing, I discovered that Diana's business, Bright Future Marketing, had expanded significantly. They had hired 5 new employees and moved into a larger office space downtown. The Hartwell Industries account was prominently featured on their website, along with several other clients that I recognized from my industry contacts. Diana was thriving professionally while I struggled to find work stocking shelves at retail stores. She had stolen not just my job and my client, but my entire career trajectory and professional future. But I still had no idea that the pattern of sabotage went back much further than my recent employment troubles. My college friend Ashley Martin reached out during this dark period, inviting me to lunch at our favorite restaurant near Northwestern University. Ashley and I had been close during college, but had drifted apart over the years as our careers took different directions. I've been thinking about you lately, Ashley said as we settled into our booth at the Italian restaurant where we had spent countless hours studying and planning our futures. I heard you were going through some professional difficulties and I wanted to check on you. I was grateful for her concern, but curious about how she had heard about my situation. Chicago's professional community was interconnected, but Ashley worked in healthcare administration, which was completely separate from marketing. Diana reached out to me a few weeks ago, Ashley explained. She's worried about you and asked if I could provide emotional support during this difficult time. She mentioned that you've been struggling with some personal issues that have affected your work. My heart sank as I realized that Diana had been contacting people from my personal life, not just my professional network. She was systematically isolating me by spreading false narratives about my character and mental health to anyone who might provide support or friendship. The conversation with Ashley revealed disturbing details about Diana's long-term manipulation campaign. She had been subtly poisoning relationships throughout my life, always presenting herself as the concerned sister while undermining my connections with other people. As I sat across from Ashley, listening to her repeat Diana's false narratives about my supposed problems, I realized that my sister's campaign of destruction had been going on for years. But I was about to discover that the professional sabotage was only part of a much larger pattern of systematic psychological warfare that had shaped my entire adult life. During the darkest period of my unemployment, Diana appeared to transform into the most supportive sister imaginable. Just as my savings account hit rock bottom and despair threatened to overwhelm me completely, she began showing up at my tiny studio apartment with bags of groceries, home-cooked meals, and what seemed like genuine emotional support. "I know you're going through a really tough time right now," Diana said one evening as she unpacked containers of my favorite chicken parmesan and garlic bread. "But family sticks together, no matter what. I want you to know that I believe in you, and I'm here to help however I can." Her kindness felt like a lifeline during those terrible weeks when I questioned everything about myself and my abilities. Diana brought me job search advice, helped me practice interview skills, and even offered to provide professional references for potential employers. She seemed genuinely invested in my success and recovery. What I didn't understand at the time was that Diana was playing the most sophisticated psychological game imaginable. While publicly supporting me, she was privately orchestrating my continued failure. Her help was designed to keep me dependent and grateful while ensuring that I never actually succeeded in rebuilding my career. Diana convinced our parents that I was going through a difficult phase that required patience and family understanding. During weekly family dinners at their house in Evanston, she would speak compassionately about my struggles while subtly reinforcing the narrative that my problems were self-created. "Francesca is really trying to turn things around," Diana would tell our parents, Margaret and Robert. "But she's dealing with some personal challenges that make it hard for her to maintain professional relationships. The important thing is that we support her through this rough patch." Margaret and Robert accepted Diana's interpretation without question. They had always seen Diana as the more stable, successful daughter, while I was viewed as the high-achieving but emotionally volatile one. Diana's version of events reinforced their existing perceptions about our different personalities and capabilities. During these family gatherings, I noticed how skillfully Diana managed the conversations. She would express concern about my mental health, suggest that I might benefit from therapy or counseling, and position herself as the family member who understood my problems best. She never said anything overtly critical, but her comments consistently undermined my credibility and independence. "I think Francesca sometimes has difficulty accepting responsibility for her mistakes," Diana would say with a sympathetic sigh. "She tends to blame external circumstances rather than looking at her own role in these situations. It's something she's struggled with since college." These subtle character assassinations were particularly effective because they contained elements that sounded reasonable to parents who wanted to understand why their daughter was struggling professionally. Diana presented herself as having special insight into my psychological makeup while gradually convincing Margaret and Robert that my version of events wasn't entirely reliable. The manipulation extended to my extended family as well. During holiday gatherings, Diana would provide carefully edited updates about my situation that painted a picture of someone who needed help rather than someone who had been sabotaged. She described my unemployment as a result of interpersonal conflicts and professional disagreements that suggested problems with my character rather than external attacks on my career. My cousin Linda approached me during Thanksgiving dinner with concern that had clearly been shaped by Diana's narratives. "We're all worried about you," Linda said as we stood in the kitchen helping with dessert preparation. "Diana mentioned that you've been having trouble maintaining professional relationships. Have you considered talking to someone about stress management or workplace communication skills?" The suggestion was well-intentioned, but based on completely false premises that Diana had carefully planted. Linda genuinely believed she was offering helpful advice to a family member who was struggling with personal issues rather than supporting someone who had been systematically attacked. Diana's manipulation was so subtle that even I began to question my own perceptions. When you're unemployed, financially stressed, and socially isolated, it becomes easy to wonder whether your problems really are self-created. Diana reinforced these doubts by constantly suggesting that I needed to take responsibility for my situation and learn from my mistakes. "I know this is a difficult time for you," she would say during her supportive visits, "but maybe this is an opportunity to reflect on patterns in your life that might need changing. Sometimes these setbacks happen for a reason." The gaslighting was masterful because it was wrapped in apparent love and concern. Diana never directly attacked me or my character, but she consistently implied that my problems were symptoms of deeper personal issues that I needed to address. She positioned herself as the wise, stable sister who was trying to help me grow and improve. 3 months into my unemployment, I discovered something that shattered my trust in Diana completely. I was staying late at the public library using their computers for job applications when I heard a familiar voice in the next carrel. Diana was on the phone with someone speaking in a tone I had never heard her use before. "The plan is working perfectly," Diana was saying, her voice filled with satisfaction and amusement. "Francesca is completely dependent on me now, and our parents think I'm being incredibly supportive during her crisis. She has no idea that I'm the one who destroyed her precious career." I froze in my chair, listening in disbelief as my sister continued the conversation. She was speaking to someone named Tracy, who I later learned was her business partner at Bright Future Marketing. "You should see how grateful she is when I bring her food," Diana laughed. "She actually thinks I'm helping her job search when I'm the one making sure she never finds work. It's hilarious how naive she is about people's motivations." The conversation revealed the depth of Diana's deception. She described our family dinners as performances where she played the concerned sister while subtly reinforcing narratives that kept our parents from questioning her version of events. She bragged about convincing extended family members that I was having psychological problems that required intervention and support. The best part is that she's so desperate for emotional support that she actually confides in me about how depressed and hopeless she feels. Diana continued. "I pretend to be sympathetic while taking notes for future manipulation. It's like having a psychological warfare manual written by the target herself." I sat in that library, Carol, feeling like my entire reality had collapsed. The sister who had been my emotional lifeline during the worst period of my life was actually the architect of my destruction. Every kind gesture, every supportive conversation, every moment of apparent love had been a calculated performance designed to deepen my dependence and isolation. But the phone conversation also revealed something that would become crucial to my eventual fight back. Diana mentioned that she had been stealing my ideas since college, and that taking down Premier Marketing was just her masterpiece in a long campaign of systematic sabotage. She had been planning my professional destruction for years, not months. As I walked home from the library that night, I realized that I needed to start investigating the true scope of Diana's manipulation, but I also knew that I had to continue playing the role of the grateful dependent sister until I could gather enough evidence to expose her completely. The game was far from over, and I was finally beginning to understand the rules. After overhearing Diana's phone conversation at the library, I began examining our shared history with completely new eyes. What I had always interpreted as normal sibling rivalry or unfortunate coincidences now appeared to be part of a deliberate pattern of sabotage that stretched back years. The memories that emerged painted a disturbing picture of systematic manipulation disguised as sisterly love. My mind went back to my senior year at Northwestern University when I had been selected for a prestigious summer internship at Madison Communications, one of Chicago's most respected advertising agencies. The internship was incredibly competitive, with only 3 positions available from hundreds of applicants nationwide. Landing that opportunity would have given me direct entry into the industry with connections that could have shaped my entire career trajectory. 2 weeks before the internship was scheduled to begin, I received a devastating phone call from Madison Communications' HR director. They were withdrawing their offer due to concerning information they had received about my academic performance and personal character. The HR director wouldn't provide specific details, but she mentioned that a family member had contacted them, expressing serious concerns about my stability and reliability. At the time, I was completely mystified by this development. My grades were excellent, my professors provided glowing recommendations, and I had never experienced any academic or personal problems that would justify such concerns. Diana comforted me through my disappointment, suggesting that perhaps the internship wasn't meant to be and that better opportunities would come along. Now I realized that Diana had deliberately sabotaged that opportunity by contacting Madison Communications with false information about my character. She had positioned herself as the concerned sister, trying to protect both me and the company from potential problems. The sophistication of her manipulation was evident even in college, suggesting that her campaign against me had been developing for much longer than I had ever imagined. The pattern continued through graduate school at DePaul University. My recommendation letters for the master's program in marketing communications arrived mysteriously late, nearly costing me admission to my first choice school. The admissions office mentioned that they had received a phone call from someone claiming to be my sister, expressing concerns about whether I was emotionally prepared for graduate-level work. Diana had apparently told the admissions committee that I was dealing with family stress and personal issues that might affect my academic performance. She suggested that they might want to reconsider my application, or at least delay my admission until I had addressed these supposed problems. Only my exceptionally strong undergraduate record and test scores saved my acceptance. Even my personal relationships bore signs of Diana's interference. During my junior year at Northwestern, I had been dating Brian Walsh, a pre-law student who seemed genuinely interested in building a serious relationship. We had talked about our future plans and how we might coordinate our career goals after graduation. The relationship was progressing naturally towards something meaningful and long-term. Brian broke up with me suddenly in February, claiming that he had learned some disturbing things about my character that made him question our compatibility. He wouldn't provide specific details, but he mentioned that someone close to me had reached out to him with concerns about my emotional stability and tendency toward manipulation in relationships. I was devastated by the breakup and confused by Brian's vague accusations about my character. Diana spent hours comforting me, bringing ice cream and tissues while listening to me cry about losing someone I thought I loved. She suggested that Brian might not have been the right person for me anyway, and that his willingness to believe rumors showed weak character. Now I understood that Diana had been the source of those rumors about my character. She had approached Brian with carefully constructed concerns about my mental health and relationship patterns, positioning herself as the worried sister who felt obligated to warn him about potential problems. Her comfort during my heartbreak was particularly cruel, considering that she had orchestrated the entire situation. The investigation into my past revealed dozens of similar incidents where opportunities had mysteriously disappeared, or relationships had been damaged by anonymous concerns about my character. Scholarship applications that were inexplicably rejected despite strong qualifications, study group invitations that were withdrawn due to scheduling conflicts, professor recommendations that were delayed or complicated by questions about my reliability. I contacted my college friend Ashley Martin to ask about her memories of our relationship during school. Ashley had been one of my closest friends freshman and sophomore year, but we had gradually drifted apart without any obvious cause. I had always assumed that our friendship naturally faded as we developed different interests and social circles. "I've been thinking about this since we had lunch," Ashley said when I called her. "There were some conversations I had with Diana during college that didn't make sense at the time, but now I'm wondering if there was more going on than I realized." Ashley revealed that Diana had approached her multiple times during our sophomore year, expressing concerns about my mental health and suggesting that our friendship might not be healthy for either of us. Diana claimed that I was becoming overly dependent on Ashley for emotional support, and that this dependency was preventing me from developing other relationships. Diana said you had told her that you felt like Ashley was your only real friend, and that you would be devastated if anything happened to our friendship, Ashley explained. She suggested that maybe it would be better for both of us if we gave each other some space to grow independently. The manipulation was subtle but effective. Diana had convinced Ashley that she was helping both of us by encouraging distance in our friendship. Ashley genuinely believed she was acting in my best interest when she began declining invitations and reducing our contact. She had no idea that Diana was systematically isolating me from supportive relationships. Similar conversations had apparently occurred with other friends, professors, and potential romantic partners throughout my college years. Diana presented herself as the protective sister who understood my psychological makeup better than anyone else. She convinced people that they were helping me by maintaining distance or expressing concerns about my stability. The scope of Diana's long-term manipulation campaign was breathtaking in its complexity and consistency. She had been actively sabotaging my relationship's opportunities and reputation for nearly a decade while maintaining the facade of being my most supportive family member. Every success I achieved had been despite her interference, rather than with her help. But the investigation also revealed something else that would prove crucial to my eventual defense. Diana had been sloppy in some of her early manipulation attempts, leaving evidence trails that could be documented and verified. People remembered specific conversations and could provide details about what Diana had told them about me. Mrs. Helen Rodriguez, my college academic advisor, still had notes in my file about the mysterious phone calls she had received about my emotional stability. Professor James Mitchell remembered being contacted by someone claiming to be my sister with concerns about my ability to handle academic pressure. These documented incidents established a clear pattern of interference that predated my recent career troubles by years. As I compiled this evidence, I realized that Diana's motivation went far beyond professional jealousy or sibling rivalry. She had been systematically destroying my life since college, suggesting a level of psychological pathology that was truly frightening. But I was also discovering that her pattern of manipulation had left a trail of witnesses who could corroborate my eventual accusations. The question now was whether I could gather enough evidence to expose Diana's campaign before she succeeded in completely destroying my ability to rebuild my life. But first, I needed to understand why she had targeted me so consistently and what she ultimately hoped to achieve through this systematic psychological warfare. 6 months after Diana's successful destruction of my career at Premier Marketing, our family received devastating news that would change everything yet again. Diana was diagnosed with acute leukemia during a routine medical checkup that revealed abnormal blood test results. The diagnosis came as a complete shock since she had always appeared healthy and energetic with no obvious symptoms of serious illness. Margaret called me at 7 in the morning with the news, her voice breaking with emotion as she struggled to explain what the doctors had told them. "Francesca, we need you to come home immediately. Diana is in the hospital and she's very sick. The doctors are running more tests, but they think it might be cancer." I drove to Northwestern Memorial Hospital in a state of emotional confusion. Despite everything I had recently discovered about Diana's manipulation and sabotage, she was still my sister, or at least the person I had considered my sister for 28 years. The prospect of losing her to cancer was genuinely terrifying, even though I was simultaneously angry about what she had done to my life. The hospital's oncology wing was a sobering environment, filled with patients and families dealing with life-threatening illnesses. Diana looked small and vulnerable in her hospital bed, connected to monitors and IV lines that emphasized the seriousness of her condition. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her face was pale without makeup. "Francesca, I'm so glad you're here," Diana whispered when I entered her room. Margaret and Robert were sitting beside her bed, holding her hands and looking terrified about possibly losing their daughter. "I was scared you might not come after everything that's been happening with your career troubles." The irony of her comment was stunning, considering that she was the architect of my career troubles. But I couldn't address that issue while she was fighting for her life. I squeezed her hand and assured her that family came first, despite the complicated emotions I was experiencing. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, Diana's oncologist, met with our family that afternoon to explain the diagnosis and treatment options. She was a compassionate woman in her 50s who specialized in blood cancers and had extensive experience helping patients navigate the complex treatment process. "Diana has acute lymphoblastic leukemia, which is a serious but treatable form of blood cancer," Dr. Reynolds explained as we gathered in the family conference room. "The treatment protocol involves intensive chemotherapy followed by bone marrow transplantation to ensure complete remission and prevent recurrence." The discussion of bone marrow transplantation immediately raised questions about finding compatible donors. Dr. Reynolds explained that siblings typically had the highest probability of genetic compatibility, making family members the preferred choice for donation when possible. "We'll need to test immediate family members to determine who might be suitable donors," Dr. Reynolds continued. "However, Diana specifically requested that we not put pressure on her family for donation. She doesn't want anyone to feel obligated to undergo medical procedures on her behalf." Diana's apparent consideration for our well-being seemed touching at first, but something about her request didn't feel authentic. Why would someone facing life-threatening cancer refuse to explore the most promising treatment options? The request seemed designed to create a specific dynamic rather than to protect her family from burden. Margaret immediately insisted that we all be tested as potential donors, regardless of Diana's preferences. "We're family, and we'll do whatever is necessary to save her," Margaret declared. "Diana shouldn't worry about protecting us when her life is at stake." Over the following days, Diana's illness became the central focus of our entire family's existence. Margaret took extended leave from her job as a high school principal to coordinate Diana's care and treatment schedule. Robert rearranged his consulting practice to accommodate frequent hospital visits and medical appointments. The family dynamic shifted completely around Diana's medical needs. Every conversation revolved around her treatment progress, comfort requirements, and emotional state. I was expected to put aside my own problems and focus entirely on supporting Diana through her health crisis. "This really puts things in perspective, doesn't it?" Margaret said to me during one of our hospital visits. "Your job situation seems so trivial compared to what Diana is going through. I'm sure you understand that family has to come first during times like this." The implication was clear. The unemployment and career troubles were insignificant compared to Diana's medical emergency. Any concerns I might have about my own life needed to be subordinated to the family's collective focus on Diana's survival. During one of Diana's more lucid moments between chemotherapy treatments, she asked to speak with me privately. Margaret and Robert stepped out of the hospital room, leaving us alone for what Diana claimed would be an important sister-to-sister conversation. "Francesca, I need to tell you how sorry I am about everything that's happened with your career," Diana said, her voice weak but seemingly sincere. "I know we've had our differences over the years, but facing cancer makes me realize how important family really is. I hope we can put any past problems behind us and focus on supporting each other." Her apology sounded genuine, but I noticed that she didn't actually take responsibility for any specific actions. She referred to past problems and differences as though our issues were mutual misunderstandings, rather than her systematic campaign of sabotage. Even while facing cancer, Diana was managing the narrative to avoid accountability. "I've been thinking about how I can help you rebuild your career once I get through this treatment," Diana continued. "Bright Future Marketing has developed some strong industry connections, and I'd love to introduce you to potential employers who might appreciate your talents." The offer was particularly cruel, considering that Diana was the reason I couldn't find employment in the first place. She was positioning herself as my potential savior, while concealing her role as my destroyer. But I realized that confronting her about the sabotage while she was fighting cancer would make me appear heartless to our parents and extended family. Diana's medical team scheduled her for an aggressive treatment protocol that would take several months to complete. The chemotherapy was designed to eliminate the cancer cells, but it would also severely compromise her immune system and require careful monitoring for complications. As her treatment progressed, Diana's condition became more fragile, requiring frequent hospitalizations and intensive medical support. The emotional strain on our parents was enormous as they watched their daughter fight for her life while dealing with the side effects of powerful medications. But I also noticed that Diana maintained remarkable control over family dynamics, even from her hospital bed. She orchestrated visiting schedules, managed information flow about her condition, and continued to position herself as the center of our family's emotional universe. Her illness had given her unprecedented power to demand attention and compliance from everyone around her. The situation was reaching a critical point where difficult decisions about treatment options would need to be made. And I was beginning to suspect that Diana's specific requests about donor testing were part of a larger manipulation strategy that would eventually target me directly. Margaret launched an intensive emotional campaign designed to pressure me into bone marrow donation that began within days of Diana's initial diagnosis. Her approach was sophisticated, psychological manipulation disguised as maternal concern and family loyalty. Every conversation became an opportunity to reinforce my obligation to Diana while subtly questioning my character if I showed any hesitation. "This is your chance to really show Diana how much you love her," Margaret said during one of our regular phone calls about Diana's condition. "After all the struggles you've had this year, being able to help save her life could be incredibly healing for both of you. It might even help repair some of the damage from your recent difficulties." The implication was unmistakable. My career troubles had somehow damaged my relationship with Diana, and donating bone marrow would allow me to redeem myself as a worthy family member. Margaret was reframing the donation as my opportunity to prove my love rather than as my choice about my own medical care. Robert took a quieter but equally persistent approach to building pressure for my participation. During our weekly family dinners, he would share carefully selected stories about Diana's courage during treatment and her concern for other family members despite her own suffering. Diana mentioned yesterday that she hopes her illness won't be too much of a burden on everyone, Robert said during one particularly manipulative dinner conversation. "She keeps worrying that asking for help makes her seem selfish. I told her that family members support each other without counting the cost. His comments were designed to make me feel guilty for any reluctance about donation while emphasizing Diana's supposed selflessness and consideration for others. Robert never directly asked me to donate, but his stories consistently reinforced the message that good family members sacrifice for each other without hesitation. The emotional manipulation extended to our extended family as Diana and our parents carefully managed the narrative about her illness and treatment options. During a family gathering at our cousin Marie's house, I discovered that Diana had been telling relatives a completely fabricated version of recent events that painted me as someone who had taken advantage of her generosity. "We're all so proud of how Diana supported you through your career," Troubles, our Aunt Linda said as she helped clear dishes after dinner. She told us how she tried to help you find new job opportunities and provided emotional support during your difficult period. "It must mean so much to have a sister who stands by you no matter what." The conversation revealed that Diana had been rewriting our family's understanding of the past 6 months. According to her version, she had been my primary support system during my unemployment, providing both practical assistance and emotional comfort. Our relatives had no idea that Diana was responsible for my career destruction in the first place. "Diana mentioned that you're the only family member who might be compatible for bone marrow donation," Marie continued. "She seems worried about asking you to go through medical procedures after everything you've already dealt with this year. She's always been so considerate about other people's problems." Diana had positioned herself as a thoughtful sister who was reluctant to burden me with additional stress while simultaneously ensuring that everyone knew I was her only hope for survival. The manipulation created maximum pressure for me to volunteer while allowing Diana to maintain her image as someone who never asked for help. During Diana's more difficult treatment days, Margaret would call me with emotional updates designed to emphasize the urgency of finding a bone marrow donor. Her descriptions of Diana's suffering were detailed and heartbreaking, clearly intended to motivate me toward immediate action. "The doctors are worried that Diana's body might not be strong enough to handle another round of chemotherapy," Margaret said during one particularly devastating phone call. "They think her best chance for survival is bone marrow transplantation, but they need to find a compatible donor soon. Every day we wait makes the procedure more dangerous." Margaret never directly demanded that I get tested, but her emotional manipulation made the message clear. Diana would die without bone marrow donation, and I was the most likely person to save her life. The weight of that responsibility was designed to override any concerns I might have about the donation process. Robert reinforced the pressure through seemingly casual conversations about medical advances and treatment options. He would share articles about successful bone marrow transplants and statistics about sibling donor compatibility, always emphasizing the positive outcomes and minimal risks for donors. "The survival rates for acute leukemia patients who receive bone marrow from sibling donors are really encouraging," Robert said during one of his research presentations. "The procedure is much safer for donors now than it was even 10 years ago. Most people return to normal activities within a few days." His scientific approach to the discussion was designed to address any practical concerns I might have about donation, while reinforcing the narrative that refusing would be unreasonable and selfish. The emotional and logical pressure combined to create an environment where saying no would require me to appear heartless and irresponsible. The manipulation campaign intensified when Diana's condition worsened during her second round of chemotherapy. She developed complications that required intensive care and raised serious questions about her prognosis without immediate intervention. Margaret arranged for me to speak with Dr. Reynolds directly about Diana's treatment options and the potential role of bone marrow transplantation. The conversation was framed as educational, but I realized that Dr. Reynolds had been briefed to emphasize my importance in Diana's treatment plan. Siblings typically provide the best genetic match for bone marrow donation, Dr. Reynolds explained during our phone conversation. If you're compatible, you could literally save your sister's life. The procedure is relatively routine for donors, but it could mean the difference between life and death for Diana. Dr. Reynolds was presenting accurate medical information, but the timing and context of our conversation were clearly orchestrated by Margaret and Diana to maximize pressure for my participation. The medical authority of her recommendations added weight to the family's emotional appeals. But even as I was subjected to this intensive manipulation campaign, I was beginning to notice inconsistencies in Diana's behavior that suggested her illness might be part of a larger pattern of control and manipulation. Her requests for privacy about donor testing seemed designed to create specific family dynamics rather than to protect anyone from medical burden. The question was whether Diana's medical crisis was genuine or whether she was using her illness as the ultimate manipulation tool to gain control over our family while positioning herself as a victim who deserved everyone's complete sacrifice and devotion. Under the relentless pressure from Margaret Robert and Diana's tearful bedside pleas, I finally agreed to undergo testing for bone marrow compatibility. The decision felt inevitable, given the family dynamics and emotional manipulation, but I told myself that if the tests showed we weren't compatible, the choice would be made for me without requiring direct confrontation about Diana's past behavior. The appointment was scheduled at Northwestern Memorial Hospital's Bone Marrow Donor Testing Center on a Tuesday morning in November. I filled out extensive medical history forms while trying to convince myself that I was doing the right thing for family unity, regardless of the complicated emotions surrounding my relationship with Diana. Dr. Patricia Reynolds conducted the consultation personally, rather than delegating to a resident or nurse practitioner. Her presence seemed unusual for routine compatibility testing, but Margaret had specifically requested that Diana's primary oncologist oversee every aspect of my evaluation process. I want to make sure you understand exactly what bone marrow donation involves, Dr. Reynolds said, as she reviewed my medical history and current health status. The procedure itself is relatively straightforward, but it does require commitment from the donor throughout the preparation and recovery process. She explained the technical details of bone marrow harvesting, the preparation medications I would need to take, and the timeline for Diana's treatment if I proved compatible. Everything sounded medical and routine, but Dr. Reynolds also asked several questions that seemed to probe my emotional readiness for donation. Some donors experience conflicted feelings about undergoing medical procedures for family members, Dr. Reynolds said carefully. If you have any concerns or reservations about donation, it's important that we discuss them now rather than later in the process. Her questions made me realize that my reluctance must have been obvious during our previous conversations. Dr. Reynolds seemed to be assessing whether I was truly committed to donation or whether I might withdraw consent later in the process, potentially jeopardizing Diana's treatment timeline. I'm committed to helping Diana however I can, I assured her, though my voice probably didn't convey complete confidence. My only concern is whether the donation will actually be effective for her treatment. The blood samples and genetic testing were completed within 30 minutes, but Dr. Reynolds mentioned that comprehensive compatibility analysis would take several days. She emphasized that preliminary results would be available quickly, but detailed genetic matching required more extensive laboratory work. We should have preliminary results within 48 hours, Dr. Reynolds explained. If those initial tests look promising, we'll proceed with more detailed analysis to confirm compatibility and assess the quality of potential bone marrow match. I left the hospital feeling emotionally drained but also relieved that the decision process was now out of my hands. Either I would be compatible and would need to follow through with donation, or I wouldn't be compatible and could support Diana's treatment in other ways without undergoing medical procedures myself. Margaret called that evening to thank me for agreeing to testing And to reiterate how much my willingness meant to Diana and the entire family, her gratitude felt genuine, but it also reinforced the emotional pressure I would face if the test results were positive. Diana was so relieved when I told her you had agreed to testing, Margaret said. She's been worried about asking you to consider donation after everything you've been dealing with this year. Your willingness to help shows what kind of person you really are. The next 2 days passed slowly as I waited for preliminary results while trying to manage my complicated feelings about the situation. Part of me hoped the tests would show incompatibility, which would resolve my dilemma without requiring me to refuse donation directly. But another part of me felt guilty for hoping that I couldn't help save Diana's life regardless of our personal history. Dr. Reynolds called Thursday afternoon with news that fundamentally changed everything I thought I understood about my family relationships. Her voice contained a mixture of medical excitement and personal confusion that immediately captured my attention. Francesca, I have very unusual results from your compatibility testing, Dr. Reynolds said. You're not just compatible with Diana for bone marrow donation, you're what we call a perfect match with unusually high compatibility rates across all genetic markers. She explained that my genetic profile matched Diana's with remarkable precision, showing compatibility rates that exceeded normal expectations even for biological siblings. The results suggested an extraordinarily close genetic relationship that would make bone marrow transplantation highly likely to succeed. This level of compatibility is quite rare, Dr. Reynolds continued. Even between biological siblings, we typically see some genetic variations that create minor compatibility challenges. Your results show almost identical genetic profiles in the areas that matter for bone marrow transplantation. But as Dr. Reynolds discussed the medical implications of our genetic compatibility, she mentioned something that triggered a memory that had been buried for years. She referenced our family medical history and the importance of understanding inherited genetic factors that might affect Diana's treatment and recovery. Based on the genetic markers we've identified, both you and Diana carry several inherited traits that appear in your family line, Dr. Reynolds said. These genetic patterns will help us optimize Diana's treatment protocol and anticipate potential complications during recovery. The conversation forced me to realize that I knew virtually nothing about Diana's early childhood or our shared family medical history. Margaret and Robert had always spoken about our adoption as though we were biological sisters who happened to be adopted together, but I had never seen documentation or asked detailed questions about our birth families. When Dr. Reynolds mentioned specific genetic markers that supposedly ran in our family, I realized I couldn't provide any information about inherited medical conditions or family health patterns. Margaret and Robert had always handled medical appointments and health questions, so I had never needed to understand our genetic background independently. Dr. Reynolds, I need to ask you something that might sound strange, I said hesitantly. What exactly do you know about Diana's and my family medical history? I'm realizing that I don't have as much information as I should about our genetic background. There was a pause before Dr. Reynolds responded, and I could hear uncertainty in her voice. I have the family medical history that your parents provided when Diana began treatment. But now that you mention it, some of the information seems incomplete or inconsistent with the genetic patterns we're seeing in your test results. Her comment raised immediate questions about what Margaret and Robert had told the medical team about our family background. If our genetic compatibility was unusually high, but our documented family history was inconsistent with genetic evidence, something fundamental about our family structure might be different from what I had always believed. Would it be possible for me to review the family medical history information that you have on file? I asked. I want to make sure I can provide accurate information for Diana's treatment planning. Dr. Reynolds agreed to arrange a meeting where we could review the medical history documentation together. But her willingness to share that information suggested that she had also noticed inconsistencies that raised questions about the accuracy of what our parents had provided. As I ended the phone call, I realized that the bone marrow compatibility testing had revealed something much more significant than my ability to help Diana medically. The genetic analysis had raised fundamental questions about our family relationships that I needed to investigate before proceeding with any medical procedures. The perfect genetic match between Diana and me was pointing toward a truth about our family that had been hidden for 28 years. But I needed concrete evidence before confronting anyone with accusations that could destroy our family relationships permanently. The inconsistencies in our documented family medical history haunted me for days after my conversation with Dr. Reynolds. I found myself questioning basic assumptions about my family background that I had never thought to verify. How could Diana and I have such perfect genetic compatibility while our medical records seemed incomplete or inconsistent with genetic evidence? I decided to investigate our adoption records, something I had never questioned, despite being raised with the knowledge that both Diana and I were adopted as infants. Margaret and Robert had always presented our adoption as a wonderful story about creating a loving family, but they had never provided detailed information about the process or our birth families. Finding adoption records proved more complicated than I expected. The agency that handled our adoptions, Family Connection Services, had merged with another organization in the early 2000s, and their record-keeping systems had been transferred to the new agency's headquarters in downtown Chicago. After several phone calls and bureaucratic transfers, I was able to speak with Mrs. Helen Carter, a retired social worker who had worked at Family Connection Services during the time period when Diana and I were placed with Margaret and Robert. Mrs. Carter was in her 70s now, but remembered our case because adoptions of sibling pairs were relatively uncommon. "I'd be happy to meet with you to discuss your adoption," Mrs. Carter said when I called her. "But I should mention that there might be some confusion about your family situation that we should clarify in person." Her comment about confusion immediately raised red flags. Why would there be confusion about a straightforward sibling adoption that occurred nearly 30 years ago? Mrs. Carter agreed to meet me at a coffee shop near her retirement community the following Tuesday. Mrs. Carter was a small, grandmother-like woman who radiated warmth and professional competence despite her advanced age. She brought a manila folder containing what she said were her personal notes about our adoption case, which she had kept when she retired from active social work. "Before we begin, I need to ask you what your parents told you about your adoption," Mrs. Carter said, as we settled into a quiet corner booth. "I want to understand what you believe about your family history before I share information that might be different from what you've heard." I explained that Margaret and Robert had told me that Diana and I were biological sisters who were adopted together as infants after our birth parents died in an accident. We had always been told that keeping us together was important for our emotional development and family bonding. Mrs. Carter looked uncomfortable as I described our family's adoption story. She opened her folder and reviewed handwritten notes that were yellowed with age before responding to my explanation. "Francesca, I'm afraid that's not accurate," Mrs. Carter said gently. "Diana and you were never biological sisters. You were both adopted as infants, but from different birth mothers and at different times. Diana was adopted first when she was 6 months old, and you were placed with Margaret and Robert 6 months later when you became available." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Everything I had believed about my family relationships was based on a fundamental lie that had been maintained for nearly 3 decades. Diana and I shared no biological connection despite being raised as sisters, and despite our remarkably similar genetic compatibility for bone marrow donation. Why would my parents tell me we were biological sisters if that wasn't true? I asked, struggling to process the implications of what Mrs. Carter was telling me. Mrs. Carter consulted her notes again before explaining the complex circumstances surrounding our adoptions. Margaret and Robert specifically requested two girls close in age who they could raise as sisters. When Diana's adoption was finalized, they asked to be contacted if another infant girl became available who might be a suitable companion for Diana. She explained that our parents had been concerned about Diana's adjustment to family life and thought that having a sister close in age would provide emotional support and companionship. When I became available for adoption 6 months later, they saw me as the perfect addition to complete their family vision. The decision to tell you that you were biological sisters was made when you were older and started asking questions about your family history, Mrs. Carter continued. Margaret felt that it would be simpler and less emotionally complicated if you believed you shared the same birth parents. The simplification had created a foundational lie that shaped my entire understanding of my identity and family relationships. But Mrs. Carter's revelation also raised disturbing questions about Diana's awareness of our true family structure. Would Diana have known that we weren't biological sisters? I asked, dreading the answer, but needing to understand the scope of the deception. Mrs. Carter's expression grew more serious as she consulted her notes about Diana's early development and family adjustment. Diana was 6 months old when she was adopted, but she was old enough to have some awareness of life before you arrived. She would have remembered being the only child in the family before you joined them. The implications were devastating. Diana had always known that we weren't biological sisters, but she had allowed me to believe the lie for 28 years, while using that false family bond to justify her manipulation and emotional control over my life. There's something else you should know, Mrs. Carter said hesitantly. I have notes indicating that Diana's adjustment to your arrival was problematic. She showed signs of jealousy and resentment about sharing Margaret and Robert's attention with another child. Mrs. Carter's notes documented behavioral problems that Diana exhibited after my adoption, including aggressive behavior toward me, attempts to exclude me from family activities, and what social workers recognized as early signs of sibling rivalry taken to unhealthy extremes. We recommended family counseling to help Diana adjust to having a sister, Mrs. Carter explained. But Margaret and Robert felt that the problems would resolve naturally as you both grew older. They believed that treating you as biological sisters would eliminate the jealousy issues. The counseling recommendation had been ignored, allowing Diana's resentment and competitive behavior to develop unchecked throughout our childhood. What our parents interpreted as normal sibling rivalry was actually a deep psychological rejection of my place in the family that had been festering for decades. Did my parents understand that Diana knew we weren't biological sisters, I asked, trying to understand how much of the family deception was intentional versus misguided. Mrs. Carter consulted her notes one final time before providing an answer that completed my understanding of the family dynamics. Yes, Margaret was aware that Diana knew the truth. Diana actually threatened to run away from home if Margaret ever told you that you weren't biological sisters. Margaret chose to protect Diana's secret to maintain family stability. The revelation meant that Margaret had been actively participating in Diana's psychological manipulation for years. She had enabled Diana's false narrative about our relationship while allowing me to be deceived about fundamental aspects of my own identity and family history. As I left the coffee shop that afternoon, I realized that I needed concrete scientific evidence to support Mrs. Carter's revelations before confronting anyone about the lies and manipulation. But I also understood that Diana's campaign against me hadn't been driven by sibling rivalry or professional jealousy. It had been motivated by a deep psychological resentment about sharing our parents' love with someone she considered an outsider who didn't belong in the family. The bone marrow compatibility testing had opened a door to family secrets that would fundamentally change my understanding of everything I thought I knew about my life and relationships. But I still needed definitive proof before I could use this information to fight back against Diana's systematic psychological warfare. Mrs. Carter's revelations about our adoption left me emotionally shattered, but also determined to obtain scientific proof of what I now suspected about my family relationships. The knowledge that Diana and I weren't biological sisters explained the perfect bone marrow compatibility that had puzzled Dr. Reynolds, but I needed concrete DNA evidence before confronting anyone about the decades of lies and manipulation. I researched DNA testing options online and discovered that several companies offered comprehensive genetic analysis that could definitively establish whether two people shared biological family connections. The testing process was straightforward, requiring only saliva samples that could be collected at home and mailed to laboratory facilities for analysis. The challenge was obtaining Diana's DNA sample without her knowledge or consent. She was still hospitalized for cancer treatment, which made access to her personal belongings and biological materials potentially possible, but I needed to be careful not to compromise her medical care or violate her privacy in ways that could backfire legally. I ordered a DNA testing kit from GeneTech Laboratories, a company that specialized in family relationship analysis with results that would be legally admissible if needed for future proceedings. The kit arrived within 3 days and included detailed instructions for sample collection and chain of custody documentation. Collecting my own DNA sample was simple, requiring only a few minutes to provide adequate saliva in the sterile collection tube. But obtaining Diana's sample required planning and opportunity that would allow me to collect her genetic material without arousing suspicion from hospital staff or family members. The opportunity came during one of my regular hospital visits when Margaret and Robert had stepped out to speak with Dr. Reynolds about Diana's treatment progress. Diana was sleeping after her latest chemotherapy session, and I was alone in her room for approximately 15 minutes. Diana's personal hairbrush was on the bedside table, along with other toiletries that Margaret had brought from home to make her hospital stay more comfortable. The brush contained several strands of Diana's hair with follicles attached, which would provide sufficient genetic material for comprehensive DNA analysis. I carefully collected several hair samples and placed them in the second collection tube provided in the testing kit. The process took less than 2 minutes, and I was able to complete the sample documentation without disturbing Diana or attracting attention from hospital staff. Mailing the samples to GeneTech Laboratories felt like crossing a point of no return in my investigation of our family relationships. The results would either confirm Mrs. Carter's revelations or force me to question my own perceptions about what had been happening in my life. The waiting period for DNA results was listed as 10 to 14 business days, but GeneTech offered expedited processing for an additional fee that would provide results within 5 business days. I paid for the expedited service because I suspected that Diana's medical condition might reach a crisis point that would pressure me into making decisions before I had complete information. During the waiting period, I struggled with maintaining normal family interactions while harboring such significant suspicions about our fundamental relationships. Margaret continued her emotional manipulation campaign about bone marrow donation, and Diana maintained her performance as the brave cancer patient who was concerned about burdening her family with medical decisions. The doctors are optimistic about Diana's response to treatment, but they really need to move forward with bone marrow transplantation soon, Margaret said during one of our daily phone conversations. Dr. Reynolds mentioned that your compatibility results were excellent, so we're just waiting for you to feel ready to proceed with the donation process. The pressure was intensifying because Diana's medical team was scheduling her treatment protocol around the assumption that I would provide bone marrow donation within the next few weeks. Delaying the decision much longer would potentially compromise Diana's treatment options and recovery timeline. But I also suspected that Diana might be manipulating her medical crisis to create maximum pressure for my compliance with bone marrow donation. Her specific requests about donor testing had seemed designed to control family dynamics rather than to protect anyone from medical burden. 3 days into the waiting period for DNA results, Margaret called with disturbing news about Diana's emotional state and medical progress. Diana had apparently suffered a setback during her latest treatment cycle and was experiencing complications that worried her medical team. "Diana is asking specifically for you, Margaret," said her voice heavy with emotion. "She's worried that she might not survive this treatment cycle, and she wants to have an important conversation with her sister while she still has strength." The request felt manipulative, designed to increase my emotional investment in Diana's survival, while positioning me to feel responsible if something happened to her before I agreed to bone marrow donation. But I couldn't refuse to visit without appearing heartless to our parents and extended family. Diana appeared genuinely weak when I arrived at the hospital that evening. Her skin was pale from the chemotherapy effects, and she seemed to have lost additional weight since my previous visit. But her mental alertness and emotional control remained intact despite her physical deterioration. "Francesca, I need to tell you how sorry I am for any problems between us over the years," Diana said, reaching for my hand with what appeared to be sincere emotion. "Facing death makes you realize how petty most conflicts really are. I hope we can put any past misunderstandings behind us and focus on being sisters." Her apology was carefully worded to acknowledge problems and misunderstandings without taking responsibility for specific actions or admitting deliberate wrongdoing. Even while apologizing, Diana was managing the narrative to minimize her accountability, while emphasizing my role in maintaining family harmony. "I've been thinking about how much I love you and how grateful I am that we've been sisters all these years," Diana continued. "Whatever happens with my treatment, I want you to know that you've been the most important person in my life." The emotional manipulation was sophisticated and effective, designed to make me feel guilty for any resentment, while reinforcing the family bonds that Diana had been exploiting throughout our relationship. But I also noticed that she emphasized our status as sisters repeatedly, almost as though she was reinforcing that connection deliberately. "Diana, there's something I need to ask you about our family history," I said carefully. "I've been thinking about our adoption and realizing that I don't know much about our early childhood or how we came to be placed together." Diana's expression changed subtly when I mentioned our adoption. Her emotional vulnerability was replaced momentarily by alertness and caution that suggested she was evaluating how much I might know about our family background. "What do you mean?" Diana asked, her voice taking on a guarded tone despite her apparent physical weakness. "Our parents have always been open about our adoption. We were lucky that they could keep us together when our birth parents died." Her response confirmed that she was still maintaining the false narrative about our biological relationship, even during what she claimed might be her final conversation with me. Diana was committed to the lie that had shaped our entire family dynamic for nearly 3 decades. "I guess I'm just curious about the details of how the adoption process worked," I said, watching her reaction carefully. "It seems unusual that we would have been placed together so easily if our birth parents died suddenly." Diana seemed to recognize that my questions were potentially dangerous to the family narrative she had worked so hard to maintain. Her physical weakness appeared to diminish as she focused on managing this threat to her psychological control. "Francesca, I think the stress of my illness is making you overthink things that don't really matter," Diana said, her tone becoming slightly manipulative despite her apparent concern. "Our adoption story is what our parents have always told us. Why would you question their honesty about something so fundamental?" The conversation confirmed my suspicions that Diana was actively protecting the lies about our family relationships while using her illness to deflect uncomfortable questions. She was maintaining her manipulation strategy even while facing potential death, which suggested a level of psychological pathology that was truly disturbing. As I left the hospital that evening, I realized that confronting Diana about our family lies before receiving DNA confirmation could backfire badly. If she alerted Margaret and Robert about my suspicions, they might coordinate their stories or find ways to discredit my investigation. The DNA results were now only 2 days away, and I needed to maintain my family performance until I had scientific proof that would support any accusations I might make. But I was also running out of time before Diana's medical team would expect a final decision about bone marrow donation. The next phase of my investigation would require absolute precision and careful timing to avoid giving Diana the opportunity to manipulate the situation further. But I was finally close to obtaining the evidence I needed to fight back against 28 years of systematic psychological warfare disguised as family love. While waiting for the DNA test results, I began systematically documenting Diana's pattern of manipulation and sabotage throughout my life. Mrs. Carter's revelations about our adoption had provided a framework for understanding Diana's motivations, but I needed comprehensive evidence that would support my eventual accusations about her systematic campaign against me. I started by contacting former colleagues, college friends, and family members to gather specific information about their interactions with Diana over the years. My approach was careful and indirect, presenting my inquiries as part of a personal reflection process rather than an investigation into Diana's behavior. Marcus Thompson, my former colleague at Premier Marketing Solutions, provided crucial information about Diana's business activities that went far beyond the Hartwell Industries theft. When I called Marcus to ask about his memories of Diana's visit to our office, he revealed disturbing details about her broader campaign against Chicago marketing firms. "I've been thinking about this since we last talked," Marcus said during our phone conversation. "Diana approached several people in our industry over the past year, not just about you specifically. She was gathering information about upcoming contracts, client relationships, and competitive strategies from multiple firms." Marcus explained that Diana had been systematically networking with marketing professionals throughout Chicago, presenting herself as someone interested in industry collaboration while actually conducting corporate espionage for her own business benefit. She attended networking events and professional conferences where she would strike up conversations about client work and business development strategies, Marcus continued. People shared information with her because she seemed genuinely interested in building professional relationships. The scope of Diana's manipulation extended far beyond personal attacks on my reputation. She had been conducting sophisticated business intelligence gathering that allowed her to compete unfairly against established marketing firms while building her own company's client base. "I think Diana targeted you specifically because you were the biggest competitive threat to her business expansion," Marcus concluded. "Your client relationships and strategic skills represented obstacles to her professional goals, so eliminating you from the industry served multiple purposes." This information revealed that Diana's sabotage of my career wasn't just about sibling rivalry or psychological pathology. It was a calculated business strategy designed to eliminate competition while advancing her own professional interests at my expense. I contacted Ashley Martin to ask more detailed questions about Diana's interactions with our college friends and professors. Ashley had been thinking about our previous conversation and had remembered additional incidents that seemed suspicious in retrospect. "Diana approached several of our professors during senior year with concerns about your emotional stability," Ashley revealed. "She told Professor Williams that you were under tremendous stress about graduation and might not be able to handle the pressure of final exams and job interviews." Ashley explained that Diana had positioned herself as a concerned sister who was monitoring my mental health and academic performance. She convinced professors that they should provide additional support and supervision to help me succeed despite my supposed psychological problems. The professors thought Diana was being incredibly supportive by advocating for accommodations that might help you graduate successfully, Ashley continued, but now I realize that she was actually undermining your independence and making you appear unstable to people who controlled your academic future. Diana had been using concern about my mental health as a manipulation tool since college, convincing authority figures that I needed special assistance while simultaneously creating doubts about my reliability and competence. Professor James Mitchell confirmed Ashley's account when I contacted him directly about Diana's interactions with our academic department. Professor Mitchell had been my thesis advisor and remembered Diana's visits to his office during my senior year. Your sister was quite concerned about your ability to complete your thesis project on schedule, Professor Mitchell recalled. She mentioned that you had been struggling with perfectionist tendencies that were causing anxiety and depression. She asked if there were ways the department could provide additional support. Diana had convinced Professor Mitchell that I was suffering from perfectionist anxiety that might prevent me from completing graduation requirements. Her interference had created additional scrutiny of my academic work while positioning her as a caring sister who was trying to help me succeed. Diana suggested that you might benefit from extended deadlines or alternative thesis requirements that would reduce your stress levels, Professor Mitchell continued. She seemed genuinely worried about your mental health and academic success. The manipulation had been sophisticated enough to convince caring professors that Diana was advocating for my well-being while actually undermining my academic reputation and independence. She had been sabotaging my relationships with authority figures while maintaining the facade of sisterly support. I also discovered evidence of Diana's interference in my personal relationships that extended beyond the college boyfriend she had driven away. My friend Sarah Jenkins from graduate school remembered uncomfortable conversations with Diana about my dating patterns and social behavior. Diana called me several times during your second year at DePaul with concerns about your romantic relationships, Sarah revealed. She said you had a pattern of becoming too attached to boyfriends and that your emotional intensity was scaring people away. Diana had been poisoning my friendships by suggesting that my romantic relationships were unhealthy and that I was emotionally unstable in ways that affected my social interactions. Sarah had distanced herself from me based on Diana's false narratives about my character and relationship patterns. Diana asked me to monitor your behavior and let her know if I noticed signs that you were becoming obsessive about dating or social situations, Sarah continued. She presented it as family concern about your emotional development and social skills. The revelation that Diana had recruited my friends to monitor and report on my behavior was particularly disturbing. She had been building a surveillance network that allowed her to gather information about my personal life while controlling the narratives that shaped my social relationships. Dr. Sandra Kim, the therapist, I had seen briefly during graduate school for stress management, provided information that connected Diana's manipulation to my actual mental health experiences. When I contacted Dr. Kim to ask about our sessions, she remembered receiving phone calls from Diana about my treatment. Your sister contacted me several times expressing concern about your progress in therapy, Dr. Kim revealed. She wanted to know if you were addressing underlying issues that might be affecting your academic and social functioning. Diana had been attempting to gather information about my private therapy sessions while positioning herself as a concerned family member who needed updates about my psychological treatment. Dr. Kim had maintained professional boundaries, but Diana's attempts at interference demonstrated her desire to control even my mental health care. Diana suggested that family therapy might be beneficial because she had insights about your psychological patterns that could help with treatment planning, Dr. Kim continued. She seemed very invested in your therapeutic progress, but also concerned about your resistance to family input. The evidence was accumulating into a clear pattern of systematic interference that had shaped every aspect of my adult life. Diana hadn't just sabotaged specific opportunities or relationships. She had been conducting comprehensive psychological warfare designed to control my academic, professional, and personal development. But the most disturbing discovery came from Margaret herself during a family dinner conversation that revealed the depth of her complicity in Diana's manipulation campaign. When I asked casual questions about our childhood, Margaret accidentally provided information that confirmed her awareness of Diana's behavioral problems. Diana has always been protective of you sometimes to an excessive degree, Margaret said, without realizing the implications of her comment. Even as children, she would get upset when other people showed interest in you or when you received attention that she felt belonged to her. Margaret described incidents from our childhood where Diana had sabotaged my friendships, destroyed my possessions, and manipulated family situations to ensure that she remained the focus of parental attention. But Margaret had interpreted these behaviors as evidence of Diana's love rather than signs of psychological problems. Diana would sometimes tell us that your friends were bad influences or that you were making poor choices that required family intervention, Margaret continued. She was always trying to protect you from situations that might hurt you or lead you astray. The evidence showed that Diana's manipulation had been enabled and supported by our parents throughout our lives. Margaret and Robert had accepted Diana's narratives without question, while allowing her to control family dynamics and my relationships with other people. As I compiled this evidence, I realized that Diana's campaign against me hadn't been hidden or secretive. Multiple people had witnessed her interference and manipulation, but they had interpreted her behavior as evidence of concern and love rather than psychological abuse. Diana had been conducting her warfare in plain sight while maintaining plausible deniability about her motivations. The DNA test results were expected within 24 hours, and I would finally have scientific proof to support the evidence I had gathered about Diana's systematic deception. But I was also realizing that exposing Diana's manipulation would require confronting not just her lies, but the willful blindness of everyone who had enabled her behavior throughout our lives. The DNA test results arrived by email on a Friday morning while I was drinking coffee in my small apartment and trying to prepare mentally for whatever the scientific evidence would reveal. The subject line was simply Gene Tech Laboratories DNA Analysis Complete, with instructions to log into their secure portal using the reference number provided with my testing kit. My hands trembled as I entered the login information and waited for the results page to load. 28 years of family relationships and personal identity were about to be confirmed or shattered by genetic science that would provide definitive answers about my biological connection to Diana. The results appeared on screen with clinical precision that left no room for interpretation or doubt. Under relationship analysis, the report stated clearly, the tested individuals show no genetic markers indicating family relationship. Probability of biological siblingship 0%. The subjects are not related by blood. I stared at the screen for several minutes, absorbing the scientific confirmation of what Mrs. Carter had told me and what I had suspected since learning about our adoption circumstances. Diana and I shared absolutely no biological connection despite being raised as sisters and despite 28 years of family narratives that claimed otherwise. The detailed genetic analysis provided additional information that explained the bone marrow compatibility that had confused Dr. Reynolds. According to the report, Diana and I both carried genetic markers that were common in Northern European populations, which created superficial compatibility for certain medical procedures, despite our lack of family relationship. Bone marrow compatibility can occur between unrelated individuals who share common genetic heritage, the report explained. Successful transplantation does not require family relationship, only compatible genetic markers in specific chromosomal regions. The scientific evidence meant that my perfect compatibility for Diana's bone marrow transplant was a coincidence rather than evidence of biological sisterhood. Dr. Reynolds had been puzzled by our genetic similarity, because she had assumed we were biological sisters based on our family's false narratives. I printed multiple copies of the DNA results and stored them in different locations to ensure that the evidence would be available when I needed it for confrontation with my family. The scientific proof was irrefutable and legally admissible if the situation escalated to formal accusations or legal proceedings. But as I sat in my apartment holding the DNA results, I realized that I was also holding the key to my liberation from 28 years of psychological manipulation and family control. Diana's power over me had been built on false family obligations and manufactured guilt about sisterly duties that had never been real. The phone rang while I was still processing the implications of the DNA results. Margaret's name appeared on the caller ID, and I knew immediately that this conversation would test my ability to maintain the family facade while possessing knowledge that fundamentally changed everything. "Francesca, we need to talk about Diana's treatment timeline," Margaret said without preamble. "Dr. Reynolds called this morning to discuss scheduling the bone marrow donation procedure. Diana's condition has stabilized enough to proceed with transplantation, but they need to move quickly while her body can handle the procedure." The medical urgency was creating pressure for immediate decision-making about bone marrow donation. But I now knew that the family obligations Margaret was invoking were based on lies that had been maintained deliberately for decades. "The doctors want to schedule the donation procedure for next Thursday," Margaret continued. "That gives us a week to complete the preparation process and ensure that everything is ready for Diana's treatment. Dr. Reynolds mentioned that your compatibility results were exceptional, so the chances of success are very high." Margaret's tone carried expectation and assumption that I would immediately agree to proceed with donation, now that the medical team was ready to move forward. She seemed to have no doubt that I would sacrifice my time, comfort, and physical well-being for Diana's treatment needs. "I need to think about the timing and make sure I'm prepared for the procedure," I said, carefully stalling for time while I decided how to use the DNA evidence. "This is a big decision, and I want to make sure I'm doing everything right." "Francesca, there's nothing to think about," Margaret said, her voice becoming sharp with impatience. "Diana's life depends on this procedure, and you're her only hope for survival. Every day we delay increases the risk that her condition will deteriorate beyond the point where transplantation is possible." The emotional manipulation was intensifying as Margaret sensed my hesitation about immediate compliance with the donation timeline. She was using Diana's medical crisis to override any concerns I might have about undergoing medical procedures for someone who had systematically destroyed my life. "I understand that the donation process involves some discomfort and inconvenience for you," Margaret continued. "But this is what family members do for each other. Diana would do the same thing for you without question if your situations were reversed." The irony of Margaret's comment about Diana's hypothetical sacrifice was stunning, considering that Diana had spent years actively harming me while presenting herself as a devoted sister. The DNA results proved that Diana had been manipulating family obligations that didn't actually exist. "Mom, I need to ask you something important about our family history," I said, testing whether Margaret would maintain the lies even under direct questioning. "I've been thinking about our adoption and wondering about the details of how Diana and I came to be placed together." There was a pause before Margaret responded, and I could hear wariness in her voice as she recognized the potential danger of my questions. I don't understand why you're asking about ancient history when Diana's life is at stake, Margaret said, deflecting rather than answering directly. Our adoption story is exactly what we've always told you. Why would you question something so fundamental when we need to focus on saving Diana's life? Margaret was using Diana's medical emergency to avoid discussing the family lies, while simultaneously reinforcing the false narratives about our biological relationship. She was protecting the deception even while pressuring me to undergo medical procedures based on fabricated family obligations. I just want to understand our family medical history better so I can provide accurate information to the doctors, I said, giving Margaret an opportunity to tell the truth voluntarily. It seems important that Diana's medical team has complete information about our genetic background. The doctors have all the information they need, Margaret said firmly. Your job is to focus on being a good sister and helping Diana survive this crisis. Everything else can wait until after she's recovered. Margaret was refusing to acknowledge the truth about our adoption, even when given multiple opportunities to correct the family narrative. Her commitment to protecting Diana's lies was absolute, regardless of the consequences for my understanding of my own identity and family relationships. As I ended the phone call, I realized that Margaret was fully complicit in Diana's manipulation campaign and would continue enabling her behavior even in the face of contradictory evidence. Confronting the family lies would require presenting the DNA results in a way that eliminated any possibility of denial or further manipulation. But I also understood that Diana's medical condition was reaching a crisis point that would force the final confrontation sooner than I had anticipated. The family pressure for bone marrow donation was intensifying, and I would need to reveal the truth before being cornered into a medical procedure based on false family obligations. The next few days would determine whether I could finally break free from Diana's psychological control or whether her manipulation would succeed in forcing me to sacrifice myself for someone who had never been my sister and who had spent decades systematically destroying my life. The DNA results had given me the evidence I needed to fight back, but using that evidence effectively would require careful timing and strategic thinking about how to expose 28 years of lies without allowing Diana to manipulate the situation further. Diana's medical condition took a sudden turn for the worse on Tuesday evening, creating an emergency situation that forced the final confrontation sooner than I had planned. Margaret called at 11 o'clock at night, her voice panicked and desperate, as she explained that Diana had been rushed to intensive care with complications that threatened her immediate survival. "You need to come to the hospital right now," Margaret said, crying into the phone. Diana's blood pressure dropped dangerously low, and her body isn't responding to medication the way the doctors expected. They think she might not make it through the night without immediate intervention. The medical crisis was genuine, according to the nursing staff who updated me when I arrived at Northwestern Memorial's intensive care unit. Diana's body was rejecting the latest round of chemotherapy, creating systemic complications that required immediate life support measures and emergency treatment protocols. Dr. Reynolds met me in the family conference room along with Margaret Robert and a hospital social worker who was there to facilitate difficult medical decisions. The atmosphere was tense and emotional as everyone grappled with the possibility that Diana might not survive long enough to receive bone marrow transplantation. "Diana's condition has deteriorated rapidly," Dr. Reynolds explained as she reviewed the latest test results. "Her body is shutting down faster than we anticipated, and we need to make critical decisions about treatment options immediately. Bone marrow transplantation is now her only chance for survival, but the window for successful transplantation is closing rapidly." The medical emergency had compressed our timeline from weeks to hours, creating maximum pressure for immediate decision-making about my participation in Diana's treatment. Dr. Reynolds emphasized that delaying bone marrow donation even by a few days could eliminate Diana's chances for survival. We need to begin the donor preparation process immediately if we're going to proceed with transplantation, Dr. Reynolds continued. Francesca, your bone marrow compatibility gives Diana the best possible chance for successful treatment, but we need your consent to move forward tonight. Margaret erupted with emotional appeals that filled the conference room with accusations, guilt, and desperate pleading designed to override any hesitation I might have about immediate compliance with the medical team's requests. "You owe your sister your bone marrow," Margaret screamed, her voice echoing off the sterile walls of the hospital conference room. "This is family. Diana would do anything for you, and now it's your turn to save her life. How can you even hesitate when she's dying?" Robert joined Margaret's emotional assault with quieter but equally manipulative appeals about family duty and moral obligation. He reminded me of everything Diana had supposedly done for me over the years, emphasizing my responsibility to reciprocate her love and support during her medical crisis. "Diana has been there for you through every difficult time in your life," Robert said, his voice heavy with disappointment and judgment. "When you lost your job, when you were struggling emotionally, when you needed family support, Diana was always there. Now she needs you, and this is how you respond." The family pressure was overwhelming and designed to make me appear heartless and selfish if I refused to immediately consent to bone marrow donation. Margaret and Robert were weaponizing Diana's medical emergency to force compliance with their demands, while making any resistance seem morally indefensible. Diana lay in the hospital bed, connected to monitors and life support equipment, but she was conscious enough to participate in the emotional manipulation campaign. Her voice was weak and barely audible, but her words were carefully chosen to maximize guilt and family pressure. "Francesca, I know I haven't been a perfect sister," Diana whispered, tears streaming down her pale cheeks, "but I love you so much and I need you to help me live. Please don't let me die when you have the power to save me. Family is all we have." The hospital social worker observed the family dynamics with professional concern, clearly recognizing the intense emotional pressure being applied to coerce my medical participation. But she was also bound by institutional protocols that prioritize patient survival over donor consent processes. "This is obviously a very emotional situation for everyone," the social worker said diplomatically, "but we need to remember that bone marrow donation is a significant medical procedure that requires informed consent from a willing donor. Francesca has the right to make this decision without pressure or coercion." Margaret turned her fury toward the social worker, rejecting any suggestion that my consent might be optional or that family pressure was inappropriate under the circumstances. "This is not about consent or rights," Margaret shouted. "This is about family love and moral obligation. Francesca is Diana's sister, and sisters save each other's lives when they have the power to do so. There's no decision to make here." The confrontation was reaching a climax that would force me to either submit to the family manipulation or expose the lies that had controlled my entire life. The DNA test results were in my purse, and I realized that this hospital conference room would become the setting for revealing 28 years of deception. "It's family," Margaret continued, screaming, her voice reaching a crescendo of emotional desperation. "Diana is your sister, and she's going to die if you don't help her. How can you be so selfish when family needs you?" I looked around the room at Margaret's tear-stained face, Robert's disappointed expression, Diana's desperate pleading, and Dr. Reynolds's professional expectation that I would immediately consent to medical procedures. The social worker waited for my response while clearly hoping I would agree to donation and resolve the crisis. "Actually, she's not my sister," I said quietly, reaching into my purse to retrieve the DNA test results that would shatter every assumption about our family relationships. The room fell completely silent as I pulled out the printed genetic analysis and placed it on the conference table where everyone could see the official laboratory letterhead and scientific conclusions. 28 years of lies were about to be exposed in the most dramatic way possible. "What did you just say?" Margaret asked, her voice dropping to a whisper as she stared at the DNA results without immediately understanding their significance. "Diana is not my biological sister," I repeated, opening the folder to reveal the genetic analysis that proved our complete lack of family relationship. We share no genetic markers indicating family connection. Probability of biological siblingship 0%. Dr. Reynolds leaned forward to examine the DNA results, her professional training allowing her to quickly understand the implications of the genetic evidence. The bone marrow compatibility that had puzzled her was now explained by the revelation that her assumptions about our family relationship had been completely wrong. "I don't understand," Dr. Reynolds said, looking between the DNA results and our family with obvious confusion. "The family medical history you provided indicated that Diana and Francesca were biological sisters. How is this possible?" Margaret's face went white as she realized that the foundational lies about our family structure were being exposed in the worst possible setting. She had never anticipated that I would obtain scientific evidence to challenge the narratives that had controlled our family for decades. Diana's weak voice cut through the stunned silence as she attempted to maintain her manipulation even while facing exposure of the fundamental deception that had enabled her psychological control. "Francesca, this isn't the time for whatever emotional breakdown you're having," Diana said, trying to dismiss the DNA evidence as a product of my supposed mental instability. "I'm dying and you're talking nonsense about genetics and family relationships that don't matter." But I was no longer willing to allow Diana to gaslight me or dismiss evidence that exposed her systematic manipulation. The DNA results were irrefutable, and the hospital setting provided witnesses who could verify the truth about our family lies. "Diana, you've known we weren't biological sisters your entire life," I said, my voice growing stronger as I prepared to reveal everything I had discovered about her campaign of sabotage. "You've been lying to me for 28 years while systematically destroying my life and manipulating our entire family." The confrontation was about to explode into complete exposure of Diana's manipulation campaign, but it was also taking place while she lay dying in a hospital bed, creating a moral complexity that would test everyone's ability to separate truth from emotional manipulation. The hospital conference room erupted in chaos as I began presenting evidence of Diana's systematic sabotage and manipulation campaign. Margaret and Robert initially refused to believe that their perfect daughter could be capable of such calculated cruelty, while Diana attempted to maintain her victim persona by claiming I was having a mental breakdown under stress. "This is completely insane," Margaret said, her voice rising as she rejected the DNA evidence and my accusations about Diana's behavior. "Diana has been nothing but supportive and loving throughout your entire life. She's been worried about your emotional stability for months, and this proves that she was right to be concerned." Margaret was clinging to Diana's long-established narrative about my mental health problems while refusing to acknowledge the scientific evidence that proved our family relationship was based on lies. She had invested too much emotional energy in protecting Diana to accept the truth about her manipulation. "Francesca is obviously having some kind of psychological crisis," Robert added, supporting Margaret's attempt to dismiss my revelations as symptoms of mental illness. "The stress of Diana's medical situation has clearly pushed her beyond her ability to cope rationally. She needs professional help, not encouragement for these paranoid delusions." Diana watched our parents' reactions with satisfaction, despite her physical weakness, recognizing that her years of psychological groundwork were protecting her, even in the face of direct exposure. She had successfully conditioned Margaret and Robert to interpret any accusations against her as evidence of my instability. "I've been worried about Francesca's mental health for a long time," Diana said weakly from her hospital bed, maintaining her performance as the concerned sister despite being confronted with evidence of her manipulation. "She's been struggling with paranoid thoughts and conspiracy theories since she lost her job. This DNA test obsession is just another symptom of her psychological problems." But I was prepared for their attempts to gaslight me and dismiss the evidence. I pulled out additional documentation that I had gathered over the past weeks, including Mrs. Carter's notes about our adoption testimonials from college friends about Diana's interference and evidence of her corporate espionage at Premier Marketing. "Diana didn't just lie about our biological relationship," I said, spreading the documentation across the conference table for everyone to see. "She's been systematically sabotaging my career, destroying my relationships, and manipulating our family for decades while pretending to be my loving sister." Dr. Reynolds and the hospital social worker observed the family confrontation with growing concern, recognizing that they were witnessing the exposure of serious psychological abuse and manipulation that extended far beyond medical decision-making. I presented Marcus Thompson's evidence about Diana's corporate espionage at Premier Marketing, showing how she had stolen my client work and deliberately destroyed my career to advance her own business interests. The documentation included emails and witness statements that proved Diana's systematic campaign against Chicago marketing firms. Diana contacted potential employers to warn them about my character problems and ethical violations that were completely fabricated. I continued showing Margaret and Robert the evidence of Diana's professional sabotage. "She's been destroying my career opportunities while pretending to help me find work." Margaret's face began to change as she reviewed the evidence of Diana's deliberate career sabotage. The documentation was too detailed and consistent to dismiss as mental illness or paranoid delusions. Witnesses had provided specific dates, conversations, and evidence that proved Diana's manipulation campaign. "This can't be true," Margaret whispered, looking between the evidence and Diana's face for some explanation that would preserve her understanding of her daughter's character. "Diana would never do these things. She loves Francesca and has always tried to help her succeed." But Diana's facade finally began to crack under the pressure of overwhelming evidence and her family's growing recognition of her true character. The stress of maintaining her performance while facing exposure triggered an emotional eruption that revealed her authentic personality. "She deserved everything that happened to her," Diana suddenly screamed from her hospital bed, her weak voice becoming strong with fury and resentment. "Francesca was never supposed to be part of this family. She's just some random adoption who took away everything that should have been mine." The hospital room fell silent as Diana's mask of sisterly love completely disintegrated, revealing the deep psychological pathology that had driven her manipulation campaign for decades. Her parents stared in shock as their perfect daughter exposed herself as someone they had never truly known. "I was your real daughter before she came along," Diana continued, her voice filled with years of suppressed rage and jealousy. "I was special and loved until you brought home this outsider who didn't belong here. Everything I did was to prove that I was the one who deserved your love and attention." Margaret and Robert watched in horror as Diana revealed her true motivations for years of manipulation and psychological warfare. She had never accepted my place in the family and had spent decades trying to eliminate me as competition for parental love and attention. "I've been destroying her life since college because she needed to learn that she doesn't belong here." Diana confessed her medical crisis, stripping away her ability to maintain psychological control. Every failed relationship, every lost opportunity, every moment of self-doubt was my gift to her. I wanted her to understand what it feels like to be unwanted. The confession was devastating for Margaret and Robert, who who realized that their efforts to create a loving family had instead enabled Diana's systematic psychological abuse of someone they claimed to love as a daughter. Their willful blindness to Diana's character had allowed the manipulation to continue unchecked for years. "Diana, how could you do this to your sister?" Margaret asked, still struggling to understand the depth of her daughter's cruelty while clinging to false family relationships that no longer existed. "She's not my sister," Diana screamed, finally acknowledging the truth that had motivated her behavior for 28 years. "She's nobody. She's just some stranger who took my place in this family and convinced you to love her instead of focusing on your real daughter." Diana's complete breakdown revealed the psychological foundation of her manipulation campaign while simultaneously destroying any remaining family sympathy for her medical situation. Her confession had eliminated any moral obligation I might have felt to sacrifice myself for her survival. Dr. Reynolds and the hospital social worker documented Diana's admissions about systematic psychological abuse and manipulation, recognizing that they had witnessed the exposure of long-term family trauma that extended far beyond medical decision-making. Margaret and Robert sat in stunned silence as they processed the reality that their daughter had been conducting psychological warfare against someone they loved while manipulating their own perceptions and emotions for decades. The family they thought they knew had never actually existed. "I don't understand how we didn't see this," Margaret whispered, looking at Diana with horror and recognition that she had enabled years of psychological abuse through her willful blindness and favoritism. The confrontation had completely destroyed Diana's ability to manipulate family dynamics or maintain her victim persona. Her confession had liberated me from 28 years of false family obligations, while exposing the truth about her character to everyone who had previously enabled her behavior. But Diana's medical condition remained critical, and the hospital staff still needed to determine whether bone marrow transplantation would proceed despite the family revelations. The question now was whether Diana would find another donor or whether her manipulation had finally cost her the medical support she needed for survival. I walked out of that hospital conference room that night, feeling lighter than I had in years, finally liberated from the psychological chains that had bound me to a toxic family dynamic. Diana's complete confession had eliminated any guilt or obligation I might have felt about refusing bone marrow donation, and Margaret and Robert were left to confront the consequences of their decades of willful blindness to their daughter's true character. Dr. Reynolds immediately began exploring alternative donor options through the National Bone Marrow Registry, emphasizing that biological family members were not the only potential sources for successful transplantation. Diana's medical team was committed to finding treatment solutions that didn't require my participation, especially after witnessing the family trauma that had been exposed. "We have access to a comprehensive database of potential donors who might be compatible with Diana's genetic markers," Dr. Reynolds explained to Margaret and Robert during a follow-up meeting. "While the search process will take longer than family donation, we've found matches for patients in similar situations." The search for an alternative bone marrow donor took 8 weeks, during which Diana's medical condition stabilized enough to sustain her through the waiting period. I maintained complete distance from the family during this time, refusing Margaret's attempts to guilt me into reconsidering my decision based on Diana's continued medical needs. Margaret called me repeatedly during those weeks, alternating between apologies for enabling Diana's behavior and desperate pleas for me to reconsider bone marrow donation despite everything that had been revealed about our relationship. "I know Diana did terrible things to you," Margaret said during one of her emotional phone calls, "but she's still going to die without medical intervention, and you have the power to save her life. Doesn't that matter more than our family problems?" I remained firm in my refusal, recognizing Margaret's attempts to manipulate me through false moral obligations and misplaced family loyalty. Diana's medical crisis didn't erase 28 years of systematic psychological abuse, and I had no responsibility to sacrifice myself for someone who had spent decades actively destroying my life. Mom Diana spent my entire adult life sabotaging my career, destroying my relationships, and manipulating our family while pretending to love me, I reminded Margaret during our final conversation. She confessed to systematic psychological warfare designed to make me feel unwanted and unloved. I have no obligation to help someone who has been my enemy for decades. The bone marrow registry search was successful in finding a compatible donor from the national database. A 26-year-old man from Seattle proved to be an excellent genetic match for Diana's treatment needs, and his donation allowed the transplantation to proceed without my participation. Diana's bone marrow transplant was completed successfully in early February, and her recovery progressed according to medical expectations. Her cancer went into remission, and her prognosis for long-term survival became increasingly positive as the transplanted bone marrow began producing healthy blood cells. But Diana's medical success didn't resolve the family trauma that had been exposed during our hospital confrontation. Margaret and Robert struggled to understand how they had failed to recognize their daughter's psychological pathology while enabling her systematic abuse of someone they claimed to love. Margaret and Robert eventually contacted me 6 months after Diana's successful treatment, requesting a meeting to apologize and attempt to repair our relationship. They had undergone family counseling to understand their role in enabling Diana's manipulation while exploring whether any genuine family connection could be salvaged. "We realize now that we failed you in fundamental ways," Robert said during our meeting at a neutral location downtown. "We allowed Diana to control our perceptions and manipulate our family dynamics because it was easier than confronting uncomfortable truths about her character." Margaret was more emotional in her apologies, recognizing that her favoritism toward Diana had enabled decades of psychological abuse while making me vulnerable to manipulation and control. I chose to believe Diana's version of events because she told me what I wanted to hear about our family. Margaret admitted through tears. "I ignored evidence that she was hurting you because acknowledging her behavior would have required me to take difficult action that might have disrupted our family stability." Their apologies seemed genuine, but I established clear boundaries about any future relationship. I was willing to maintain limited contact with Margaret and Robert as adoptive family members, but I refused to participate in any family activities that included Diana or to pretend that we could return to previous family dynamics. "I appreciate your apologies, but you need to understand that our family relationship has permanently changed," I told them during our meeting. "I will not tolerate any contact with Diana, and I will not participate in family events where she might be present. If you want to maintain a relationship with me, those boundaries are not negotiable." Margaret and Robert agreed to my conditions, recognizing that preserving any connection with me required respecting my need for protection from Diana's continued potential for manipulation and psychological harm. Meanwhile, I had been rebuilding my professional life in a completely different environment that was free from Diana's sphere of influence. I relocated to Denver, Colorado, where I accepted a senior marketing position with Mountain View Strategies, a growing firm that specialized in outdoor recreation and sustainable tourism marketing. The move to Denver represented both a geographic and psychological fresh start that allowed me to rebuild my career without the shadow of Diana's sabotage campaign. My new colleagues appreciated my strategic thinking and client relationship skills without any knowledge of the professional destruction I had experienced in Chicago. Within 6 months of joining Mountain View Strategies, I had successfully landed 3 major clients and been promoted to creative director with responsibility for the firm's largest accounts. My career was finally flourishing in an environment where Diana had no influence or ability to interfere. The personal healing process took longer than professional recovery, but I gradually developed genuine friendships and romantic relationships that were based on authentic connection rather than manipulation and control. Moving away from Chicago allowed me to discover who I really was without the psychological constraints that Diana had imposed throughout my adult life. I also began working with a therapist in Denver who specialized in family trauma and psychological abuse recovery. The therapeutic process helped me understand how Diana's manipulation had shaped my self-perception and relationship patterns while developing strategies for maintaining psychological independence. You survived decades of systematic psychological warfare disguised as family love, my therapist, Dr. Angela Foster, explained during one of our sessions. Recovery involves learning to trust your own perceptions and establishing relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation and guilt. The therapy process was challenging but liberating, allowing me to separate authentic emotions from manipulated responses while developing confidence in my own judgment and decision-making abilities. 18 months after leaving Chicago, I learned through mutual professional contacts that Diana's business, Bright Future Marketing, was facing legal challenges related to corporate fraud and client theft. An investigation triggered by my former colleague Marcus had revealed Diana's pattern of stealing intellectual property and conducting corporate espionage against competitors. The legal consequences for Diana's business practices included civil lawsuits from multiple companies and potential criminal charges for corporate fraud. Her professional reputation was destroyed as the scope of her unethical behavior became public knowledge throughout Chicago's marketing industry. Diana's entire business model was built on stealing ideas and sabotaging competitors. Marcus informed me during a phone call about the investigation. The evidence we gathered showed systematic fraud that affected dozens of companies and professionals over several years. The professional justice was satisfying, but it was secondary to the personal liberation I had achieved by breaking free from Diana's psychological control and establishing an authentic life based on my own choices and values. 2 years after our hospital confrontation, I had built a successful career, developed meaningful relationships, and achieved genuine happiness that was not dependent on family approval or acceptance. Diana's manipulation had been exposed and defeated, and I had emerged stronger and more self-aware than I had ever been. The most important lesson I learned from this experience was that biological family isn't automatically sacred, and that protecting yourself from toxic people is not selfish but necessary for psychological survival and personal growth. Love is earned through actions and demonstrated through respect, not demanded through obligation or enforced through guilt and manipulation. Breaking free from destructive family patterns allowed space for genuine relationships built on mutual respect and authentic care rather than duty and obligation. I discovered that chosen family, based on shared values and genuine affection, was far more meaningful than biological connections maintained through manipulation and control. I also learned that exposing truth requires courage, but that living authentically is worth the temporary discomfort of confronting lies and challenging family narratives that enable psychological abuse. Sometimes the most loving action is refusing to participate in dysfunctional dynamics that harm everyone involved. My life in Denver became a testament to the possibility of recovery and renewal after years of psychological manipulation. I had not only survived Diana's campaign of destruction, but had emerged with greater clarity about my own values, stronger relationships, and professional success that was genuinely earned rather than sabotaged or manipulated. The experience taught me that healing from family trauma requires both setting boundaries with toxic individuals and developing the self-awareness to recognize manipulation attempts in future relationships. Freedom from psychological abuse is possible, but it requires commitment to personal truth over family harmony and authentic connection over obligatory relationships. If you've experienced similar family manipulation or psychological abuse, I hope my story gives you courage to trust your own perceptions and seek the support you need to break free from toxic relationships. Have you ever discovered that family relationships weren't what they appeared to be? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Please like this story if it resonated with you, subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming family challenges, and share this with anyone who might benefit from knowing they're not alone in dealing with complicated family dynamics. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that your well-being and authenticity matter more than maintaining relationships that harm your spirit and growth.